Добрий ранок, триває 107-й день.
Good morning. This is 107th day of the Ukrainian resistance. I'm Vasily for the Ukrainian Media Center, and we start the day with the interview with Mariana Oleskiv, the head of the state agency for the promotion of tourism. So we'll discuss tourism with Mariana. Good morning. So my first question to you is, can tourism happen in Ukraine, especially in the context of war? Well, tourism as an industry has always played an important role in the Ukrainian economy. So tourism is an industry that Ukraine needs to revive, and this is a factor that has wide-reaching ramifications with a number of other industries. We can't call the movements of people these days tourism, but we still have the hospitality industry in place, and it operated during the hostilities, even in Kyiv and elsewhere. In the first few months, we've seen a massive movement of internally displaced people fleeing conflict areas for safer areas, and we see a rapid increase in the tourist fees. And this is the fee people pay when they stay in hotel, motels, or other accommodation facilities. The restaurant industry changed gears to feed the IDPs, to feed the army and other people. So today, the question all the industry is asking themselves is, how do we revive domestic travel, as they are important for the communities and all the people involved in the economic supply chain. So we are engaging with the tourist operators to organize such trips for Ukrainians to a number of locations which are historical, cultural, and of educational value. Well, the revival of tourism isn't only about the hard numbers, but also about the attitudes. Can I take leisure whilst the war is raging? This is what Ukrainian people are asking themselves. How do we tackle that? This is a very difficult question to answer, as it's hard on the people to cross the threshold. But one of the US presidents, and my memory fails me to recall the name, he was playing golf during the war, and he was asked, how can you be now playing golf when the country is at war? And his response was that if I can distract myself and play golf, then a lot of ideas come to my head. And this is my way of doing more to help my country win the war. And the idea of land lease was conceived as one of the top officials was taking a break. So we all need a chance to reboot ourselves. We're all exhausted as a country. We are suffering from the post-traumatic syndrome, and we need to find ways to unwind. And I was visiting the resorts in Lviv region, such as Morshin, Truskavets, and we looked into the facilities that can help the veterans, the injured, the people who've been afflicted by the war could go to recover. People who sustained trauma need to have a chance to recover before they can go back to their usual way of life. So they need to go through the mental and psychological rehabilitation best in a natural environment. So you were right that this is not an easy decision to make, so we need to communicate it clearly. Where will Ukrainians go to rest? There are few locations that are receiving tourists these days. These are the western regions of the country as well as the central regions. We cannot open a tourist season in the south as much territory is under Russian occupation. Much territory is now the area of operations. Fine. If you could give us an understanding of the tourist industry overall. So the tourist fees have hiked in Kyiv, in Lviv, but there are other operators, those organizing trips abroad, some other vectors of tourism as business. How is the industry faring overall? Well, the tourism industry as such is hard pressed, as tourism is one of the first industry to be hit hard in times of economic crisis or recession, to say less about the war or the hostilities. Earlier in COVID times, we thought we were going through the worst patch ever, but now with the war, we are in a true predicament which exacerbated the plight of the industry. The tourist operators and tourist agents were hit first as they're out of work. These days, the two operators of domestic tourism are beginning to relaunch their operations. So one such tour operator in the western part of Ukraine is operating at 30% of last year's capacity. That's as much for domestic tourism. We don't have any tourists traveling into Ukraine, with the exception of tourism international organizations which need a certain tourist services, but the percentage is lower compared to the domestic tourism. The same pertains to tourist agencies. There are no critical, the tourism abroad is not a critical import, so the tour agents cannot organize such tours. The demand is minimum for such tours. So we're developing a common action plan to revive the industry. These are rehabilitation programs with the support of the International Foundation for the servicemen, for children, for women, as well as certain programs to help provide institutional support to the industry. We will need to draw on international assistance as the Ukrainian budget is servicing the needs of the army and critical and social infrastructure. What are the prospects for tourism after our victory? What's bound to change? The nature of tourism is bound to change. And looking at other countries, we know that in the 5-10 years horizon, the tourism is set to grow, and Ukraine will grow in its popularity as a tourist destination. But security will be the key concern in the post-war years, and this should be our key message that we need to communicate. Many people will want to go to the battlefields, to the sites of valor of the Ukrainian people, to the sites of grief of the Ukrainian people. And now we're working with the stakeholders to mark, organize such sites, and this will be memorial tourism both for domestic and foreign tourists. Well, if we're talking about the post-war tourism, Ukrainians will want to go to the seaside and may find themselves close to the Russian tourists at the same place. How do we deal with that? I think it will be settled automatically anyway, as surely Ukrainians and Russians will not be put up in the same hotels. Let's believe for the future. Let's hope the Russian Empire as such will collapse and Ukrainians will play an instrumental role in the demise of the empire, and that will be the way to solve the problem, as once had happened when the Nazi regime had repented and the Nazi Germany evolved into the modern Germany, and we enjoy talking and spending leisure with Germans. But for the shorter time perspective, Ukrainians wouldn't want to stay in the same facilities with the Russians as it is fraught with conflict. Such precedents have happened in Turkey, in Egypt. Early on, the number of tourists from Russia has declined drastically. All the countries are considering alternative markets to replace Russian markets because of the logistics and economic recession. There are countries that are still receiving Russians and Ukrainians are opting out of those countries, but this is definitely an important consideration. I heard that Russia will be stricken off the Global Tourist Organization. Is this accurate? Yes, Russia was expelled from the World Tourist Organization in the early days of war. We started a very active international campaign so that the countries would sever cooperation ties with Russia, making sure Russia is banned from the international tourist community. There was the emergency session of the association where Russia was banned, most countries voting in favor. And today we see Russia losing its platform for international communication, international arrangements, having sustained severe reputational losses. This wasn't an easy making, as a number of African and Asian countries were arguing that tourism isn't about territorial integrity or human rights, it's a separate matter that is just about peace and something good. We countered the argument, saying that. That annexation of Crimea happened, and this was a tourist destination of Ukraine, and it was converted into a military base. Other tourist destinations in Ukraine were occupied. Currently in the south of Ukraine, such as Kirilivka, where 18 um, local government staff members were abducted, and this is a way to disrupt tourism in Ukraine and globally too, as there are a lot of processes that have hit the tourism hard with the beginning war with the Russian aggression. Looking on the upside, it's that Russians cannot book housing through Airbnb, so if they're Russian nationals, they're banned. And the same doesn't happen in Russia. Hotels in Russia aren't don't have the access to the booking platforms such as Expedia, Booking.com, Hotels.com, and other international platforms. The other good news we received last week was that Marriott is fully withdrawing from Russia and taking its brand with it. And other international brands, together with Marriott, have seized their investments in Russia and are now pulling out. Uh, I hope that happens. We talked to Mariana Oleskiv, the head of the State Agency for the Development of Tourism, but we still have a question from the audience, so please hang on with us. Hi. This is Oleskiv. I happen to be in Lviv. I have this question for you. There's so-called military tourism or post-conflict tourism, and this calls for the visits to the area of hostilities. Usually, those tourists are wealthy They would come and take a selfie on the ruins and look cool, but also it's a chance for Ukraine now that um, Ukrainian presence in the global information field is receding. We can use this as an opportunity to relay the atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine, the hostilities that took place in Ukraine, to stay on the radar in the world. So, how do you feel about this kind of tourism? It's there. um, we can confirm that this is happening. We have some tourist operators receiving such requests. Usually, people are coming with a humanitarian mission, bringing in humanitarian relief, helping as volunteers. I don't think this would be right to promote Ukraine as a destination for military tourism, because then it would be difficult to reverse the image. We'd like to try to accumulate the demand for tourism in Ukraine and, yes, show the impact of the war, but offset that with demonstrating the beauty of our country and the wonderful infrastructure we have to host the tourists. As now people are seeing a lot of uh, heartbreaking footage of the devastation in Ukraine, and we need to counter that with showing the beauty of Ukraine and raise interest to Ukraine in that way. What about the operators prepared to receive tourists in Ukraine? Uh, do they have the same legal footing as in peacetime, or has anything changed? No, they are on the same legal footing. If it's a domestic operator, they don't need to get a license. They just need to give us a notification that they are setting up their operation and be licensed when the marshal's law comes to the end. Thank you very much. And let's thank Mariana Oleskiv, the head of the State Agency for the Development of Tourism. So we discussed tourism in Ukraine for now and for the future. The next briefing is coming up until 9:30. We'll talk to Andriy Dykun, the head of the All Ukrainian Agrarian Council.
Триває 107-й день українського спротиву.
This is 107th day of Ukrainian resistance. I'm Vasily Samopalov from the Media Center Ukraine. With us we have Andriy Dykun, the head of the All-Ukrainian Agrarian Council. Good day. Let me start with the very specific questions of exporting Ukrainian grain. In realistic terms, what are the prospects for the export? What specific formats can you have faith in? Thank you for your question. Thank you for raising this topic as it's of highest relevance in Ukraine and globally. If we consider the situation that evolved before the 24th of February, the aggression, we exported 5 million tons of grain a month. In the years of our independence, we built our export through the Ukrainian ports. So 5 million were exported through the ports exclusively. Currently, the ports are blocked. Some ports are occupied, but the key ports are blocked, leaving 2 Danube ports. Currently, Ukraine has about 22-23 million tons of grain in excess. This is the grain we are in a position to export, and we haven't exported them before the new harvest. So, talking numbers, in March we'll be able to export through the western border 220,000 tons. In April, we exported through the western border around 900,000 tons and 1,700,000 tons in May. So the Ukrainian railroad is working actively, bringing grain, and the trucks are used to bring grain, and some 500,000 has been exported through Danube ports, but that isn't enough. And now there is a need seen in Ukraine and globally to unblock the Ukrainian ports. We weren't prepared for this eventuality. We relied on our ports to export our produce. Now we need to deliver the grain by west to be able to change the tracks on the rail carriages to have alternatives at hand. We can still ramp up our exports, but we will not be in a position to export all grain before the next harvest, which is starting in Bessarabia region. And the lion's share of reaping is to start in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Even though some territories are occupied in Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, including a lot of arable lands. So we will not be able to collect our harvest in these territories. Nonetheless, we still have too much grain. We are expecting to have in September, October, 55 million tons of grain that we won't be able to export. So as agriculture business, we need to raise the question at all the different platforms. We are advocating the need to unblock the ports, talking to our counterparts in the world, relaying the information to them. But still, we know, should a political decision be made tomorrow that the ports be unblocked, we will still need to demine the sea, and that will take months. So we are now preparing to organize storage facilities for excess grain. We'll be looking for 10 million tons of grain that we won't have the capacity to accommodate. We won't be able to build the silos or the storage facilities within the time. Perhaps Agrarian will find some temporary storage facilities, and we'll start procuring and bringing in the plastic sheaths. This is a relatively cheap storage technology, so we'll be using those technical sheaths to store grain. Even should we be able to preserve it, the question will be, will we be able to harvest it? our estimates comply with the estimates of the Ministry of the Agriculture. We will need to provide the agrarians to be able to harvest the crops and to sow the next harvest. We'll need $6 million. And this is a critical demand that we are advocating with the government, with the ministry. The government did an incredible thing, giving state guarantees on loans, and many agrarian companies made use of the opportunity to receive state guarantees, and this was a wonderful thing. But now we know we won't be able to sell grain if we don't have the revenue to buy fuel, we don't have the revenue to buy the seed, etc. And this is exactly what I wanted to clarify. What's going to happen if the grain cannot be exported within the next 6 months? Let me answer that question. There's a more critical question. Receiving the revenue to harvest the grain, we need to harvest it before we can export it. We also need to organize the storage facilities, but that's something requiring funding. Nobody's going to give us those storage sheaths for free. This is not an option. So the question is, how do we get the funding for the harvesting campaign and for the next sowing campaign? And once we collect it, it can stay up to 6 months. And then we'll need to consider what are we going to do in years' time when the new harvest comes in. If we don't start exporting by then, we'll be hard pressed. There'll be no options. What do you mean when you say there'll be no options? There'll be no options is going to be a big trouble. Now we are bursting at our seams. We have difficulty collecting the harvest. Some territories have been able to sow, some haven't, because of the hostilities, occupation, mining of the fields. 75 of the planned target was sown already. Some agrarians didn't have the money to fund the input. Some are going to have a lower yield, and we don't know what the weather conditions are going to be. Still, if we can find those storage facility, this will be a savior for this season. But for next years, it's going to be a major trouble as we won't have ability to save anything. We won't be able to build such facilities to accommodate 60, 70 million tons. If by winter we don't start exporting grain by sea, then there'll be no sense of taking to the fields the next spring at all. Why grow the produce that you cannot sell? What are the countries doing that have and remain our trading partners, that have received our grain? Let's be honest. They're acting strange. It's a miracle to me why in the first days of war the issues of food security hasn't been raised. There are right international organizations specifically set up for that. There's food and agriculture organizations with the UN that has the explicit mandate. We got in touch with the FAO in February saying that the ports are blocked. We won't be able to export Ukrainian produce, which is going to trigger a global food crisis as many countries rely on Ukrainian grain. This lasted for months. The first statement of FAO was ridiculous. We did find the reasons behind it. As the head of FAO is a Chinese national, his first deputy is a Russian national. And in the early days of war, he didn't want the food crisis issue to be raised. This was a matter of the Russian propaganda. They talked about the alleged denazification of Ukraine, the special operation, as they called it, and they foiled our attempts to raise the question of food crisis. If you monitor the Western mass media, there was no mention of food crisis in March or April. And if some Ukrainian organizations could break out, we would raise the question, and we would hear some nods in response saying, "Oh, it's war, it's a chemical attack that's imminent." So this is not a time to talk about the food security. And then the countries have seen that India cannot export grain because they had a dry season, and the Europeans have seen if there is famine in Africa, millions will flood into Europe, whilst the Ukrainians are fleeing the war into Europe, and that's one thing. But if millions of Africans flee famine in Africa, it's going to be a very different scenario. The number of vessels bringing migrants from Africa have um, multiplied by scores. There isn't much famine, but this is a bad omen. I don't think that people expected Ukraine to fall, and that this war to be short term. And this seems what the others expected, and did expect the war to last, as it is a very costly war for our partners, for ourselves, and for our enemy. So people might have been hoping that the war would be over in a month or two. So now we have this tax, we've given this instrument to our enemy. Putin had the energy, resources, and Europe isn't homogeneous. It's not all supportive of Ukraine. There are some that are ardent supporters of Ukraine, and then there are Hungarians who are not. And Putin is using oil and gas as blackmail, but now he's also using food as blackmail. And the Russian propaganda tried to shift the focus. It wasn't allegedly Russia denying the expert. It's not the naval vessels in the Black Sea. They haven't captured Crimea. They're not shelling Ukraine from their naval vessels. It's the Ukrainians who've mined the ports, and now Russians are prepared to be the good angels who are prepared to give the safe passage to the vessel should Ukraine demine its waters. This is nonsensical. There are negotiations between Turkey and Russia, and I hope Turkey is our partner, but I don't believe the Russians giving their word, and I know the negotiations are going to be void. I'm happy that there is an increasing awareness of the imminent food crisis in the world. It could be the major food crisis over the last dozens of years. And Russia showed us full responsibility for the food crisis. I don't see a food crisis imminent for Ukraine, but our biggest economy industry is going to suffer badly because we can't sell our produce. On the other hand, we haven't exported, and we are selling 1,700,000 in a month. We haven't exported 5 million through the western border, but at least it's something. So we are working very hard to make the exports happen, but it's not enough to save the countries which are endangered, which are beginning to see some hunger riots. Egypt has reached out to the World Bank seeking funding for grain, as the food is becoming increasingly expensive in the world. It's cheaper in Ukraine, meanwhile. And another point I would like to make, which is just as important, and it's that to reap the harvest, we need fuel. And we need more fuel. The correlation is 30 to 70 between the sowing and the harvesting campaign. We had our reserves that we made in the fall and winter for the sowing campaign, but now our oil depot have been destroyed by Russia. So Russia is deliberately exterminating the Ukrainian economy. No one denied the economic warfare. So Putin is allegedly prepared to help Ukrainians export grain, but they are destroying one of the most modern terminals in Mykolaiv port. 60% of the fuel that went into Ukraine was received from Belarus and Russia. and 15% was received from elsewhere. Now we're not receiving petrol from Russia, Belarus, as they are our adversaries. We can't bring the port, we can't bring it by sea in Kremenchuk, or refinery is at a standstill. We're trying to bring some petrol by trucks and trailers. We're getting some petrol, but how will the farmers get the fuel for their works? There's shortage at the petrol stations, and the prices have hiked. So we're expecting, we still have time before the major harvesting campaign. So we're hoping that ways to fund the harvesting campaign will be found, and the farmers will be provided with fuel. The economists are saying that the best bet of the agriculture industry is about processing. Is it realistic? It is realistic in the long-term prospects. We've all seen the situation that has evolved and reconsidered it. Earlier, there were many buyers for our grain and we sold it at a profit. But now, there are just as many people wanting to buy our grain, but we cannot uh, sell it through ports, but we should think how we can sell it at added value, like grain through milk, grain through meat, grain through added value. So the Russian Federation is there to stay. And people in Ukraine, the politicians, east to west, have a good understanding of who our enemy is. And this enemy is tangible and real. This is not a matter of 50 shades of grey. It's either black or white. Russia is our enemy. And Russia is targeting the rail infrastructure. They've blocked the ports. They are targeting it to disrupt the delivery of arms to Ukraine, but also collateral damage is foiling the Ukrainian exports of grain. The unique thing is that we've been given access to the European market, which was denied to us before for the last 30 years. Now the quotas have been lifted, if for a year, but I hope we'll be able to persuade the Europeans to keep them open, and we need to have a presence on the European market, on the shelves of the European supermarkets, and to do that we need to create added value. So the strategy for the development of Ukrainian agriculture is lies in processing. Processing is difficult to organize during the war because it's difficult to find investments. Earlier, the argument was, why process if I can sell my grain, if there are people queuing to buy it? Now it's over. After our victory, there'll be a cooperation boom. The legislation is permitting. People can form cooperatives, and the governmental support um, has to continue to support agriculture as it is bringing in very attractive profit margins. And with the governmental support, we can do much more. And processing is about jobs. Let's remember that currently we have lost a lot of people who went abroad, and men have stayed in Ukraine, and still the situation will change. And if men are allowed to grow abroad, they will also travel abroad. And the main objective for all of us, for our government and the people, uh, would be to tackle our challenges and bring our people back. And the processing industry is the answer. This is the niche which could bring in millions people and offer them jobs. If people don't have a job in Ukraine, they won't come back. People will work for hire in Europe, but won't return to Ukraine if they can't make a living here. So this is a unique chance for us to bring back the people, create added value, earn high profit margins, have more jobs, more taxes. So the answer is a definite yes. Based on the current situation, blocked ports shortage of cash flow, difficulty in selling the produce. Could you give us the most optimistic scenario for the next year and the most pessimistic scenario for the next year? The most optimistic scenario is a political decision to unblock the ports. The countries, excluding Russia, including Turkey, the UK, the US, and their warships, come in and we start exporting our produce by the end of the year and a mass export through the western borders. We have 1.7 million exported in May, and that was just by optimizing the managerial processes, and we still have some potential for growth there. It could be 2 to 3 million tons. And this is the most optimistic scenario. And we start the sowing campaign for the next year. If we see that we cannot export the grain, it won't make sense for us to sow our arable lands, as we'll have excess grain and we won't sow, and the agrarian sector comprises 70% of the Ukrainian GDP and 50% of the currency proceeds before the war, and that's it. So we will see a massive decline in agriculture, a very massive decline in the economy, and we'll be increasingly dependent on our Western partners who will need to support us. So there's a direct relation to the end of war. As soon as we win, the ports will be open. It's clear. Thank you very much for your answers. We talked to Andriy Dykun, the head of the All Ukrainian Agrarian Council. We discussed the prospects for Ukraine, and we believe that things will look up for the Ukrainian agrarian market. We resume our program on Monday. See you then.